Hello and welcome to this episode of the Motherhood Made Magic podcast. Dr. Renee White is the co-founder of the Melbourne-based mother lover business Fill Your Cup. She founded the business in 2020 with her bestie, Dr. Mika Bertucci, and collectively their mission is simple: mother the mama, nurture the nurturer, and provide women the opportunity to fall in love with their postpartum experience. Before training as a postpartum doula, Renee completed a PhD in biochemistry. She has published 14 peer-reviewed publications, including in well-renowned journal, Nature. Following her scientific career, she retrained as an Australian patent and trademarks attorney and worked in a top-tier law firm for 8 years. Her thirst for evidence-based practices and research continues on a daily basis. However, it was her challenging transition into motherhood which ignited Renee's passion for a better postpartum period for all mothers. Welcome, Renee.
Thank you so much for having me, Anna. It is a pleasure to be on the other side of the microphone this time.
I know, usually you are the one recording interviews yourself, so it is lovely to have you here as my guest. Now, your podcast is titled The Science of Motherhood, and with your scientist hat on, I'm really interested in how you apply that scientific method to the realms of pregnancy, birth, and particularly in your interest in postpartum. How do these scientific paradigms and the traditional holistic care kind of paradigms of motherhood mesh together so well in your work?
That's a really great question. And I think when Mika and I were devising, our pillars for our business, Fill Your Cup, it was really important for us to obviously have that scientific edge and come from a place of what we term is evidence-based practices. And I know that phrase gets thrown around a lot. And a lot of people go, oh, evidence-based, yeah, sure, okay, yeah, I know what that is. But really, do they understand what that is? And there's also some people out there who have the misconception that evidence-based practice is simply, is it in a white lab paper and whatever that says, black and white, that's exactly what you do. Now, our practice is not like that at all. Mika and I guess as researchers, we love researching. We do it. We've got a very curious mind all the time, and we try to stay abreast of all the latest research. We've got Google alerts. We've got PubMed alerts on everything postpartum pregnancy, and we try to kind of keep ahead of all of the things that are going on. But
PubMed is a journal database for those playing at home of scholarly research articles.
But for us, and a friend of ours on Instagram who I've forgotten her handle now, but I think it's like Play, Nourish, Thrive. So Dr. Lisa, she did a really beautiful post the other week around what evidence-based is. And it falls within kind of three main pillars. You've got best scientific evidence. So I guess that's your black and white kind of research paper. It takes into account your clinical experience. So as a postpartum doula, as a scientist, what has our clinical experience been? But most importantly, it takes into account the person element. So, the patient's values or our client's values, because you can sit there and you can talk to someone about, oh, but the research said this, 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 and this. And so that means you have to do this, this, and this. Well, you know what? That doesn't always translate to everyday practice. And it doesn't always translate to what that mother's values are and how she wants to mother and how she wants to care for her baby. And so I think it's really important to understand that, when I say our business is evidence-based and we come from an evidence-based practice, we're incorporating all three of those elements: the science, the actual in-home care and clinical practice, as well as adapting those things to what the mother's values are and how that family wants to, run their house. That's a really, really important element to understand.
What are some of the areas that you have seen what you would consider as solid evidence completely misconstrued in the space of motherhood?
The two main areas at the moment, and this is something that I'm currently upskilling in, because I'm always learning. I'm not here going to sit here and go, I'm an expert on motherhood and postpartum, what have you, because I think the evidence is always evolving, the research is always evolving. And so I'm currently in the middle of training with the POSSUMS program, so the Neuroprotective Developmental Care Unit out of Brisbane in Australia. And everyone, if you're a mum or a dad or anyone who is involved with children, you will understand that the two hotly debated topics are always sleep and feeding, typically breastfeeding. Both of those are incredibly challenging areas. And what I am currently learning through the POSSUMS program is how the current research and the trend in research is that everything that we've kind of been doing, and these mainstream sleep consultants and sleep training and things like that, they're essentially turning them on their heads. So Dr. Pamela Douglas has written a fantastic book called The Discontented Little Baby Book, which has revolutionized my life. I really, really wish I had the knowledge about that book prior to my transition into motherhood, because I suffered a ton of anxiety around sleep. I engaged 2 different sleep consultants. I have, done the 1 minute in, 1 minute out, pat, like everything. I've done all of it. And it caused severe anxiety for myself, within my family. People were stepping on eggshells around me because I honestly believe that I had postnatal anxiety around sleep. And so I think those areas are 2 hotly debated areas at the moment. And I'm confident in the POSSUMS program because they have demonstrated time and time again through scientific research that what we think is right is actually not. And they're taking it back to the biology of the mother and the child. And when I talk about scientific research, I think it's important to note also for people who aren't trained as scientists that there are different qualities of science and that there's different qualities of papers. So you can honestly look up anything that you want and probably find the answer that you want in any scientific paper. But what I think a lot of the public don't understand is that when you go to write a paper, you conduct your research, you write the paper, and in most instances, you send it off to a journal. And in most instances, unless it's open access, that research is sent to reviewers, so people who understand the field, and they will critically analyze those results. So it's not just you can write whatever you like and put it into a paper and it gets published. But those people will then scrutinize it, come back to you with comments, and then you will need to either do further experimentation to fill the gaps that they see that you have in your research, or they'll make specific comments and you'll need to adjust your manuscript accordingly. But at the moment, due to social media, there is a lot going on where people are taking sentences or drawing their own conclusions from scientific research. And in fact, it's not correct. And you need to be really, really careful with your language, with, particular posts on Instagram and other social media platforms, because I've seen a lot of instances where people have taken 2 things which may be associated and they've turned it into a causation. So it, for argument's sake, it might be if you eat green beans, that's going to cause heart disease. People have said, let's just say that's what they've said. It causes heart disease. When really, maybe the scientific paper actually said, we noticed that 50% of people or 60% of people, when they had green beans as part of their diet, they had, enlarged hearts or something like that. So that's an association. It's not a causation, it's an association. And I've called out a couple of people on Instagram and said, those type of posts aren't appropriate, and particularly towards mothers as well.
We're tired and time poor. Like, we're hoping that people are doing the due diligence before they give us the information, but it's not always the case. And it's often not, because it's easier to go, oh, I agree with that. I'm going to share it because that fits with my values. Yeah, and my values are right.
Yeah. And you'll know, Anna, we learnt this in our postpartum doula training, is that, what mainstream people call it baby brain, your brain is already remodeling. And, I'm a firm believer that you're upskilling, you're becoming smarter. The research shows that. As a woman, you're becoming smarter, you're more open to understanding things like facial recognition, your EQ goes through the absolute roof, you're able to manage things like strategically and problem solve and all of these wonderful and beautiful new skills that you have. But I think the offset also is the fact that now your brain is it's so open to all new things, and it needs to be able to adapt, because you're going to have this brand new human being in your life. And as a consequence of that, there may not be like as much of a filter, because you're taking in all of this sensory experience, because you have to as a mother, right? You've got to understand what's going on with your baby and yourself, and perhaps, throw in sleep deprivation or feeding difficulties. You're sore from the labor and birth. And so you become a very, very vulnerable demographic. And so inevitably, it's 3 a.m., you're trying to get your baby back to sleep, you're feeding, and you're scrolling through Instagram, and you see something on there that someone has created within 15 minutes. They haven't researched it. It's quite possibly just a personal opinion, or they've seen a snippet of something and they've gone, oh, I'm going to just make that a causation instead of an association. And then as a mother, you spiral, and then you start to question, am I a good mother? Mother guilt. This is cascade of comparing yourself to other mothers, and am I doing a good job? And I just feel like it's a very, very dangerous game to play. And I think more people should take responsibility for those actions and understand what those consequences can be.
And often they're not doing this in a malicious way. They just have no idea either. We're not taught about the scientific method unless you are privileged enough to end up at university. And when you're at university, it is the first semester subject, research skills. Every person who goes to a first semester of university does that. But that leaves the massive percentage of people that don't reach university. People just don't know.
This is true. And I agree to an extent that, their intent is not malicious, but I also understand that the intent is obviously to get likes, and it is to get follows. And that is where I caution people, you've got to understand that you are attracting a particular demographic, and by putting content like that out there, scaremongering and putting fear within the minds of mothers, I think it's a dangerous game to play.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I was just thinking earlier about how you said that we're so open to all sorts of suggestion.
Absolutely.
As mothers, particularly in those early days, because we really want to do our best for our babies. And if somebody is saying this is the best, we're probably going to listen and consider it as an option, even if it sounds ridiculous. As somebody who is a social media contributor and has also written a book, I can tell you that anybody can go and do those things. I can't rock up tomorrow and write a scientific paper without a whole lot more rigorous critique than what that process entails. And there are quite a few books that are sitting in my bookshelf waiting for a burn pile that are specifically about motherhood that I think are really destructive to the well-being of mothers and their babies. And they're Australian written and they're not that old, and they've got the celebrity endorsement that says this is the only baby book you'll ever need. And it's
I can guess which one that's going to be. And you know what? I think I have that one on my shelf as well, because it's the squeaky wheel, isn't it?
I actually took this copy from a friend who was giving her books to other people, like when she'd finished having her babies. And I said, I'll take that one because I wanted to take it out of circulation.
Yeah, absolutely. Just on the point of you can't rock up and just write a publication. Most people can't, okay? But I think, and I don't know whether I got this point across, it is quite difficult to get something published within a scientific journal. But I would also hazard to people that if you are looking up papers, and a lot of them are publicly accessible, the full text might not be because, you've got to pay for that. But, there's certain things that you can, when you're reading it, there's certain things that you can look up on that paper and go, have a bit of a critical analysis of it yourself. How many times did they repeat these experiments? We say if it's n equals 1, then it's probably not significantly reportable data. It has to be reproducible.
By n equals 1, do you mean number equals one person? It's a case study, essentially.
They've surveyed one person, and it's like, okay, well, I mean, any person with logic understands that if they went out into the street and asked someone a question, doesn't mean that,
that's reflective of the entire population.
Exactly. So, have a look at the data. Is it unbiased? What questions were they actually asking? Have a look at the data, the actual data, the graphs in there. Have they drawn the most logical conclusion? And a really good scientific paper will also, in the discussion, talk about the gaps in their scientific, result set and the limitations of their study. And you know what? That'll be the next study that they do, because they'll be like, okay, well, this is the data that we collated. This is what we understand from the data, and these are the conclusions that we can draw from that data. However, because we didn't have X control or X variable, or we weren't able to source, this particular patient group, or whatever the case may be, that'll be for the next study. I'm always skeptical of papers where there's only one author, because I'm a firm believer that in science, it's a lot of work, first and foremost. So I highly doubt that you'd be able to do all of it by yourself. So you're either not crediting people where it's due, but more importantly is that you need to have time for reflection with your scientific results. And so you look at any of the big journals, Nature, Science, Cell, you essentially have like a soccer team worth of people on there, because the contributions are just so high. And that's what you want. You want, I guess, a symphony of minds coming together and people going, oh, wow, look at that data. This is what we're concluding together out of that. So I think that's really important for people. And I encourage people, go look at this, go look at the publications, read some publications, get comfortable with understanding how the papers are set out. And another very important thing to look for is conflicts of interest. So I noted in a news article the other day that there was, again, a scientific publication that had not been peer reviewed, so not been reviewed by people within the industry. And the second author was actually someone from government. You have to, in the scientific paper, talk about who contributed what, and if there was any conflicts of interest, where they got the funding from as well. That particular study was funded by the Victorian government. Just little things like that start to get your brain going, and you start to understand, maybe this article might have been a bit biased.
Bias is a really interesting topic, because not only is there bias in the paper and the research itself, but there's massive bias about what does and doesn't get funded. So sometimes when we're looking for information on things, it's actually difficult to find the evidence base, because the evidence doesn't exist, because the bias says we don't want this information because it doesn't suit our purposes. Yes. So there was a wonderful interview that you did recently with Lily Nichols from the US, and she is a dietitian, and one of her specialty areas is around gestational diabetes, and she was speaking about the difficulties in getting funding for any topic that goes slightly outside the lines of what is and isn't part of the dietary recommendations, gestational diabetes, and her concerns about how they've been pulled out of thin air, essentially. So that's in relation to pregnancy nutrition, but I know postpartum nutrition is one of your key interest areas. Do you have any insights there around postpartum nutrition from a scientific standpoint?
Postpartum nutrition, again, I think to your point, there's not a ton of research around it, like, white paper research. But, going back to Lily's discussion that we had, she made a really, really good point in that despite the lack of, black and white paper research, cultures across the world who would have no way of communicating with one another all seem to have a very, very similar way of nourishing their mothers post-birth. It's a lot of meat-based, animal-based products. It's a lot of slow-cooked meals, soups, broths, all that kind of really delicious, nourishing, warm spices.
Those things that leave an oily feeling in your mouth.
Yeah, just like that satiety, lots of fats and oils, as you say. And albeit there's not much research around the meals per se, what we do know is that there's particular micronutrients, so iron, vitamin A, DHAs, omega-3s, things like that. We understand the biochemistry behind those and what they do to fuel the body and what they do for things like tissue repair. So collagen is amazing for tissue repair. So you would then go, okay, well, collagen is mostly found in animal-based products. So that is why it would appear that cultures across the world seem to steer, the dishes in that direction for mothers in postpartum. And that is how we have based all of our meals for our business when we're preparing our mum's menus per week, when we devised our Fill Your Freezer meal delivery service. All of those meals are around those slow-cooked, oily meals that are easily digestible, because we all understand that digestion is a horrible thing to deal with postpartum. It's not just the nourishment of the body. It's also, we understand from the research, that it's the nourishment of the mind as well. And so things like vitamin A and iron are fantastic for mental health and energy levels and alertiveness and all those things. So it's multifactorial, and I don't believe that a lot of mothers are informed as best as they could be to understand what the effects are postpartum. We have such a heavy reliance on, as soon as we conceive, all the foods that we can and cannot eat. And then as soon as we have the baby, it feels like we just chuck all that kind of information out the window and we're left with essentially whatever's in the fridge. And
toast crusts and here's
toast
a
crust.
salad.
I mean, that was me. Toast crust, Tim Tams, and bowls of Nutri-Grain, because I didn't know any different, because I just had no idea around, postpartum specific meals and all that kind of micronutrients that would be assisting me with that sleep deprivation. It's not going to make the sleep deprivation go away, because you still have a baby, right? You're still getting up and feeding, but there are things that you can be eating that can ease that sleep deprivation and, prepare you for those restless nights.
Feel less foggy all around.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting as well. As soon as we raise the topic of animal foods, we're going to jut up against some differing perspectives about vegetarianism, veganism, effects on climate, all of those sorts of things. I have certainly been in that place of do I or don't I go down certain paths myself.
Yeah.
And I think it's worth noting that it's not impossible to do these things on vegan, vegetarian diets. But I do think it's interesting that for some cultures where they are generally vegetarian for their entire life, meat has been used for a medicinal purpose in the early postpartum period within that culture.
On that point, I mean, there's specific sections within Lily Nichols' book, The Real Food for Pregnancy, and also she discusses this exact topic with another queen of postpartum, Kimberly Ann Johnson, in her podcast around vegan and or vegetarian versus animal-based diets in the postpartum period. And, she raises some really good points. And she says in that interview that she understands that she's going to have to draw a line in the sand. But professionally and personally, Lily, was quite open and said, I can't actually advocate for a vegan diet postpartum. You're just not going to get all the micronutrients that you need. Vitamin B12 is so important in postpartum, and you just will not get that in an exclusive vegan diet. You just won't. Vegetarian, there are kind of ways. I think it goes back to that whole, those commercials. It's like you can either have this tiny piece of red meat or you can have like a bucket of spinach. I'm like, you physically can do it, but, the densities are completely different.
And it depends where your thoughts are about supplementations and the skills of your practitioners in supporting you to reach as best a level as is possible on each kind of diet. Yeah. And again, when we look at evidence-based, it still comes back to those 3 tiers that you talked about at the start.
Yeah.
Scientific
100%.
data, knowledge from their practice,
yeah,
then the values of the person. And one of those can't overrule any of the others. This is it. This is why it comes back to, if you had a mother approaching you for your meal delivery service, of course you're going to change whatever it is that needs to be changed to fit for what she wants for her family, because that's how mothers feel supported.
Yeah, our packs are split into meat-based packs and plant-based packs. And if a mum writes to us and says, I want the plant-based, but can you add the bone broth to my plant-based meals? Because some people just might have an aversion to meat. Okay, they're not necessarily vegetarian or vegan. Absolutely, we'll do that. We cater for everyone because we understand that everyone deserves to be fed. It's just like our concept is, if you're going to be fed, we want to make sure it's the most nourishing and, nutritious and just jam-packed with all that good stuff. We don't want you eating toasts and Tim Tams and Nutri-Grain. That was me. I don't want that for anyone else.
No, as tasty as that might be once every now and again, it's just not going to cut it. And you need to eat so much. If you're breastfeeding, you need to eat so much.
Yes. I have this discussion with our mamas weekly, they're so shocked. I think they're like, oh, wow, I thought I was eating a lot during pregnancy, but I'm just starving, and I'm like, yes, you are starving. Again, the research shows that the calories required postpartum are exponential in comparison to pregnancy, particularly if you're breastfeeding.
Think about the amount of calories that are in a litre of milk that's in your fridge. And then on top of that, the energy that your body has had to burn up to make that milk and have it available. It is a massive task.
Yeah, 100%. Quite often, so weekly, you know, I go into mum's houses and we'll cook a main dish and a snack. We call them sweeties, you know. Most often, our mamas start with the sweeties because they need the sugar hit, because they're just like, oh, I need that because I'm feeding round the clock and what have you. And it's funny because some of them are like, oh, I think I might have the sweetie first, as if like I'm going to judge.
It's a naughty thing. Dessert first.
I know. Oh. I was like, you can have whatever order. You can have
at
4 servings of this if you want to. There's enough food for like you know, a European background, so we don't cook for single serves. We wouldn't know how to do that. So yeah, our mums have dessert, main dessert, and then like go for it. I don't mind.
Yeah, I used to keep a packet of those really, really juicy Medjool dates next to my bed, and I would need them through the night.
Yeah, they're so good.
You know, you can cook up all this other wonderful stuff, but yeah, just give me the dates.
Our favorite is cut it in half, take the pit out, and then put like, my go-to is
like peanut butter.
Well, peanut butter, but I've got onto chocolate spread, which is mostly nuts with a little bit of cacao in it. My daughter thinks it's like the equivalent to Nutella, and I'm like laughing internally because she's just consuming a whole lot of nuts.
Perfect.
And chia and stuff. So put that in, some toasted coconut and some goji berries. Oh, man, I could eat a whole pack of those. That's like my go-to. And I'm not even pregnant, but I'm definitely postpartum, 4 years postpartum.
Oh, we're always postpartum. We can always engage in some of this deliciousness. So for those who want to dive into your podcast and your research, and also into your food delivery, amongst the other things that you do, where can we connect with you?
You can go to our website, which is ifillyourcup.com. On there are all the links to our Fill Your Freezer meal delivery, which we are currently doing fortnightly in Melbourne with a 20-kilometre radius from Kensington. So there's a range of packs there that people can choose from. We also have our in-home postpartum care offerings on the website, and links to our podcast, The Science of Motherhood, where we essentially debunk and scratch the minds of all researchers and academics in the field of pregnancy, birth, and postpartum. And we're always on Instagram, trawling, making memes, and collaborating with other like-minded people. So we are always on there for the DM. Have a chat about postpartum work.
Awesome. And I will make sure that all those links go onto our show notes as well. Is there a wisdom pearl that you would like to leave us with?
The transition to motherhood doesn't need to be as hard as what society has led us to believe. And with the right planning and people and village around you, it can be a truly beautiful experience for all mothers, and they all deserve to have that experience.
I second that. And if you want to jump over to the Science of Motherhood podcast and listen to the interview that I did, you'll be able to hear about how my experience was exactly that. Thanks so much for being with us, Dr. Renee.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you so much for having me.
I hope you found this episode got you thinking. I'd love you to continue the conversations with me on socials at annacusack postpartum, or grab my book, Mama You're Not Broken, from www.annacusack.com.au/book. If you wish to give back to this podcast and its guests, head to www.annacusack.com.au/podcast to become a patron of the show for just $5 a month. Remember to hit subscribe, and I'll see you next episode.